There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. I am here with an incredibly special panel of guests, two Irish novelists here to talk about and recommend works of Irish literature. Please welcome back to my channel, Cauvery Madhavan. Welcome back, Cauvery.
Thanks, Sean. Lovely to be here.
and Rónán Hession. Welcome back.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for having me back on. And hello, Cauvery.
Hi, Rónán.
What an absolute delight to have you here together. And you've got the green and the orange happening, so we're good to go.
Oh my God, yeah, green and orange.
And I don't know how I can fit my purple in. But so on BookTube, for several years, there's been an Irish readathon for the entire month of March. Lots of people on BookTube and elsewhere on bookish social media like to read a bunch of Irish literature in March. So I have these two lovely readers and writers on to recommend some Irish books that maybe the rest of us outside of Ireland wouldn't necessarily know about. And that's why we are here. I'm going to be doing very little talking here, and I'm just looking forward to getting some recommendations.
So Sean, can I just ask, it'd be interesting for me to understand, and I'd just be curious, what's your sort of take on, what's your perspective or expectation when somebody says to you, I want you to read, or would you like to read a bunch of Irish books for a month? Is there particular associations you have, or particular things you're looking forward to, or that would be trying to avoid, or what's the perception of Irish literature, do you think, for people who are sort of outside the Irish bubble?
What a great question. I don't know that I have a very profound answer. I am somewhat well read in Irish literature, and I've studied it at school, and I've actually had my only academic publication was on Somerville and Ross. I feel very fortunate that I've read enough now that I realize how diverse Irish literature has become. But when I think about kind of automatic assumptions that I have, I would think about fiction that is usually quite sad, characters steeped in history, so where the family history is usually important to the story. And I'm thinking about writers such as Elizabeth Bowen and many others. Lots of drinking, can I put that stereotype into the discussion? And lots of humor. So a little bit of everything, but with a particular Irish twist on it. I have now read enough Irish literature, especially really modern novels and short stories, to know that the breadth of the kind of writing that's coming out of Ireland is much wider than that. But those would be some base assumptions that I would have. Yes.
That's really interesting. And I think certainly a lot of that is recognizable, I think, in terms of the sort of canon, if you like, or if you want to call it that, of Irish literature. I know Julian Gough, who's an Irish writer and, like myself, also a musician, he had sort of criticized at times Irish literature. He said it was like a motorbike that had 10 rear view mirrors and no headlights. So there was a sort of sense, I think, Ireland is about 100 years as an independent country, and that for the first 100 years, there were certain things in society that weren't talked about, and certain things in families that weren't talked about. And I think literature at times has been a way of peeling back the lid on that and looking at it, and sort of it's been a very much a cultural process of looking at that, examining it, and a sort of a way of reckoning with it. And I think my sort of sense, and I haven't studied Irish literature, I've just read it casually as a reader. My sort of sense is that Irish literature in the last sort of 20, 30 years still has that element of it, but is also broadening out and much more diversity. And I think the domestic literary scene is very vibrant. So I think I hope in our discussion today we bring across some of that.
Cauvery, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, oh my God, I think Rónán just encapsulated it so perfectly, and I think that analogy of, the motorbike and the, looking back rather than looking forward. But I think from that looking back, such amazing literature, such amazing stories, such amazing novels have come out. I mean, I totally agree with Rónán. We have amazing writers them that I'm going to talk about, especially one debut writer, two of them actually, with their first books, just absolutely amazing. But there was a good bit of that looking back. But, I don't mind I just think that if it's a good story, and in a peculiar way, if it helps this nation to come to terms with what it did to itself, not just what others did to it, but, what people did to themselves, to their own children, to their own daughters, well and good.
And I think literature can act that way. It can sort of be a cultural memory,
Yeah.
a societal memory, because so we know ourselves, as your relatives get older or pass away, a lot of lived history is lost that isn't necessarily captured in a formal, record of public affairs. I think literature helps to do that. And I think it's helped in the process of Ireland coming of age, the first 100 years, reflecting on what to be proud of, and as a society where society failed. So I think that looking back is important.
Mm.
And I would add, listening to the comments that you're making, that I would add to what I originally said, religion and sexuality that are entangled in ways that are perhaps unique in Irish context. And I'm thinking particularly of Edna O'Brien's fiction that I immersed myself in to a great extent last year. So that I would add that to the mix, that Irish, I tend to expect that in my Irish fiction.
And it's very, very strange that I think in the last few years, people are I know myself and several of friends of mine who read have been really affected by fiction that they've read, and are almost treating it like a history lesson. And I think it's fantastic that good fiction would do that. Well-researched good fiction would do that. Because sometimes if that's the only way of conveying to people what really happened.
I haven't asked you guys in advance, but both of you are Irish novelists, and I would like to ask Cauvery to give a 1-minute elevator pitch for Rónán's novel and vice versa. Can we do that? Just one minute elevator pitch.
Will I go with Panenka, will I? I actually have it right here with me. Can I show the cover?
Just don't give me any spoilers and we're good to go.
Okay, all right. Well, I've been really, really lucky that Rónán's publisher sent me an advance copy of his new book, Panenka. I think you can see that amazing cover.
Yes.
And it's about a man, an elderly man, and he has this intense headache. You can actually see it in the painting.
Can you ever?
And I don't even know how to describe this book. It's just the most moving story of, how would I describe it? He's an ordinary man, quite an amazing story of regret, and it's how he copes with it, and how he copes with what life is sort of throws at him one after the other. And what I absolutely loved about this book is his relationship with his grandson. I mean, can you imagine a book that makes you long for a grandchild? That's what this book did to me. So it's such an amazing book. Everybody's in for a real treat.
Wonderful. And when does it publish?
End of May. Thank you, Cauvery. You're very kind. Just a complete aside, as a joke, when I said that it was out at the end of May, my brother worked with a guy and his nickname is June because his name is end of May. That's his name. Well, I don't have my copy of The Tainted here. We're moving out for renovation, so it's in a box downstairs. So The Tainted is a fantastic combination of, I think, a lot of the best of what Irish literature does. It's a story about the Kildare Rangers. It links into the mutiny over in India, which was these are an Irish regiment in the British Army reacting to what was happening back in Ireland, where the British authorities were suppressing the Irish population through a very aggressive police force called the Black and Tans. And woven into that is just a very rich family history. And I think something you really picked up in your review of it, Sean, is the sense of setting is brilliantly handled. The sense of family, there's a lot to juggle in the book, chapter after chapter, and just Cauvery makes the right choices time and time again. From a technical point of view, it's brilliantly handled, and the story is just really compelling. And I think one thing that it really defines an artist as much as anything is their choice of topic. We often talk about how people execute a piece of work, but often the most important artistic choice is the choice of topic. Cauvery's reinvention of the story of the Connacht Rangers moving into the Kildare Rangers and seeing the opportunities of threading a family story to that. It's brilliant, a very memorable novel.
Thank you, Rónán. That was just making me so good. Thank you. I'll replay this little bit when I'm sort of stuck in the next book.
So why don't we get started? You each have, I think, 6 books, so we better get going here. I can't wait to hear what you're recommending that we all read for the Irish Readathon or any time in the future. Why don't we start with Cauvery's first pick?
Okay, Sean. So my first pick is a book called A Quiet Tide by Marianne Lee. And it's her first book. And it's an amazing book. Obviously, that's why I'm recommending it. This is a book set in West Cork, very close to my heart. You know, I know the area really well. So I was able to appreciate how beautifully she's written about West Cork. But the book is about a botanist, a very young Irish botanist. Her name was Ellen Hutchins. Sorry, I'm actually going to just read from my notes. So, she catalogued over 1,000 species of seaweed and plants from Bantry Bay. And she was Ireland's first female botanist. She was a major contributor to 19th century scientific discovery. And yet, like so many brilliant women, she remained unacknowledged. Now, I'm not giving the story away when I tell you, because, at the very start, even on the back cover of the book, it's revealed that she dies very, very young. Now, she achieved this, imagine 1,000 new species identified. She wasn't educated in science, she was self-taught. She achieved all this before she died at the age of 25.
Wow.
She died in 1815. And Marianne Lee, it's a fictionalized account of her life, but it's so beautifully written. And you really feel for this young woman and her aspirations. And she was, she supplied the scientific information to male botanists who then went on to be quite famous. Now, all of them acknowledged her in their private letters to her and private letters between each other. But, to the wider world, she remained an unknown figure. But the way Marianne tells the story, it's one of those books where you can actually, if you have an iPad or a computer by your side, you can actually Google the stuff that she's discovering. It's so interesting to be able to do that, to be able to read a book and look at what this woman was doing. And interestingly enough, as Rónán said, a lot of stories in Ireland go back for some reason, well, not for some reason, we know the reason. Her story as well is a story of the craze for your own land, the craze to own your own land is what drives, her brothers to do what they did to her. And it's such a beautiful story. I'd really highly recommend it because it's true. There's history, there's biology, there's science in it. It's a fantastic story.
It sounds like such a Sean book. I have checked into it and I'm really excited about it. Fairly recently published, right?
Yeah, it was only published in 2020. But there's a festival every year in Bantry, in West Cork, that honors her memory. It's called the Ellen Hutchins Festival. There's a lot of, walking trails, and it's a very interesting festival. It's kind of a botany cum literary festival. If any of you outside Ireland ever visit at that time of the year, it's a wonderful thing to be part of.
I will look that up, maybe with Cauvery's help, and put the link to that festival in the show notes as well. Great. Let's go to Rónán's first pick.
Thanks, John. So before I give my pick, my thought process, I'll just share a little bit of that. I sort of figured that people would have access to, a list of great Irish writers, and that they would be able to figure that much out. So I tried to think, who are the writers who are writing at the moment who are perhaps not as obvious choices as either because of their background or the way they write. And also, I often think that if I were to score books, I think you should score them like you'd score Olympic gymnastics, which is that you need to score both for difficulty and execution. And so you can do a very good job of a very simple thing and you get a middling sort of score. You can do a very bad job of something that's very difficult or innovative and you get a middling score. If you do something different well, then you get the Rónán Gold Medal then, which is very prestigious in Irish literature. So what I've particularly, I'm impressed by writers who are able to go in to areas that have been written about before and find something new in them. So I'm going to start with, the first writer is a writer called Lynn Buckle. Yeah. Lynn is from the literary hotbed of Kildare, where Cauvery also lives, I think.
Oh, it's a fabulous book, Rónán. Yeah, great choice.
Called The Groundsman, and it's published by a very new press. I think it's on their second book they published. They've published a few more since. They're based in Brighton. And Lynn Buckle is from the UK, but has been in Ireland for the last 30 years. She's an artist, and this is her first novel, although she's written some short fiction since. And we spoke earlier about the focus on the family, and particularly the unhappy family in Irish literature. And your standard formation in that sort of setup is you have a little bollocks of a father in the corner who doesn't say much and just drinks. You have a mother who holds it all together, but doesn't express herself. You have the poor daughter that's there wondering what's going on, and then you have the son who's on his way off to London. That's your standard formation, right? And what Lynn does is takes a dysfunctional family setup where we do have a father who's not a very nice character. We have a disengaged mother. We have a child who's trying to cope by pretending they're a dog. You have other characters on the fringes of it. And what she really excels at is the psychology of a sort of toxic household. And it is very, very nuanced. I think one thing that I've been thinking about lately is about what marks quality writers. And I think one thing they're very good at is where you have fine grades of states of mind or fine grades of emotional state. And almost like you go to a paint shop and there's different names for every different color. They're able to do that and really identify the distinctions between those. So they don't say the person was sad, the person was angry, the person was depressed. They will have the particular nuance. And Lynn is extremely psychologically adept at that. And so we get a very dark story, but it's brilliantly told. It's a story that has been explored a lot in Irish literature, but I think she does it with a real edge. June Caldwell, who's a brilliant short story writer, blurbs the book, and she says it leaves the reader scalded, which I think is a really good phrase. And one of the reasons why it's so brutal is that Lynn is drawing very much on Greek mythology. So she herself, and you'll see from the cover the way it's sort of done like a constellation, she herself has spoken about how, the brutality of some of those Greek tragedies and to bring some of that into a domestic setting. And it's sort of around Celtic Tiger Ireland, which for those who don't know, this was the economic boom during the early 2000s, which led to a financial crash. So there were a lot of people, particularly people who bought houses and property, whose lives were very deeply affected by that. So that's the backdrop. So it's a novel that I don't think is as widely read as it deserves to be. And it is a difficult novel. So if anyone finds those subjects difficult, here's a trigger warning for that. But nevertheless, in terms of the psychology, instead of just, it's all bad, she really gets in to say, well, what exactly is bad? How did exactly did I behave? How exactly did I think?
I read it too, Sean, and it was fabulous.
Sounds my kind of book. Fabulous indeed. Great, thank you. Cauvery, what do you got next?
So I'm going to go with one of my absolute favorite writers, J.G. Farrell. That's the book, Sean. It's called The Troubles. And this book won the Lost Man Booker in 1970. And, it was one of those peculiar things that there was a rule change. And what happened was nobody won the prize in 1970. And then many years later, they kind of decided that somebody needed to win it. And he won this. One of his previous books before that had won The Siege of Krishnapur, had already won the Booker Prize. So he's quite an amazing writer. And I have a real affinity for him because, first of all, he wrote a lot about India. And he's also from West Cork. So the two things combined, and I love his writing. It was very much like William Trevor of that caliber. I know I was reading somewhere that, Salman Rushdie said that if he hadn't died so unfortunately so young, he died in a fishing accident, fishing off the coast of, one of the small villages in West Cork. He was fishing and he fell off the rocks and unfortunately drowned. And he was only 40, I think. But this book, The Troubles, it's set in the 1920s. It's about a major in the army, an Anglo-Irish character who comes back from the war to marry his fiancée. He's quite certain he got engaged to her before the war. There was never actually an engagement or an exchange of rings. But because they had a kiss behind, a palm frond, a hasty kiss, he thinks that they're engaged. And it's a very dark book, but it's comic and dark. And I'm just going to read you just the one line that sort of convinces him that he was engaged. It's this one. Indeed, the only thing he recalled quite distinctly was saying goodbye to her at an afternoon at a dance in the Brighton Hotel. They had kissed behind a screen of leaves, and reaching out to steady himself, he had put his hand down firmly on a cactus, which had rendered many of his parting words insincere. So what happens is he comes to her family home, which is actually a hotel on the southeast coast of Ireland, and her Anglo-Irish family are living in a kind of a cocoon, completely denying what's happening with the civil war in Ireland and the attacks on Anglo-Irish families and their homes. It's such a beautiful, again, written in history. It shows the trials and tribulations of Anglo-Irish people at that time, and how hard it was for them, and also their own very hardened attitudes. So I would highly recommend it, and I would highly recommend reading the rest of his books as well.
Farrell has been on my radar for several years. I must get to him, so I will start with that one. And I can hear the intertextual resonances between The Tainted and that novel very strongly as I hear you talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Holy smokes. I think I'm going to have to chuck my Irish Readathon TBR out the window. Rónán, what's your next book?
The next I picked Some Days Are Better Than Ours by a writer called Barbara Byer. She's based in Tralee in the southwest of Ireland. And one of the reasons, there was a few reasons I picked it. One is this is a collection of flash fiction. And flash fiction has become a very sort of vibrant part of the writing scene. And particularly there are a lot of journals and there are a lot of online openings for people to publish flash fiction. It's a very, very difficult form to do well, but it hasn't, for some reason, it hasn't really broken through into sort of published book collections as much, even though Ireland has a very strong short story tradition and a very, very, very strong short story scene. We haven't seen as many collections of flash fiction, so I thought it would be interesting to have that in the mix. Barbara is an extremely skillful writer. Flash fiction essentially is 2 or 2.5 pages at most of a story, and it's very, very difficult to get from the start to the finish and something happen in the middle in that sort of space. And she does it brilliantly. They're sort of like sailor's knots. When you look at them, you kind of can't really see how they're done, but they just sort of work. And they avoid, I mentioned earlier, you get high marks for doing something difficult well. The trap of flash fiction or the trap of short stories is where you either have contrived twist or where there's like a very sort of puzzling ending that leaves you wondering. And I think Barbara's brilliant at sort of threading that sort of obstacle. So I think the stories, there are about, I'd say about 20 or so in it. One thing that amazes me with short story writers and flash fiction writers is the ability to think of so many different premises. If you're a novelist, you can milk a premise for 2 or 3 years and produce a book. If you're a short story writer, you have to do that a dozen times more. So I think be able to do that without repeating yourself, to be able to do that without resorting to formats, without resorting to tricks, requires real inventiveness. And I think it's a very interesting form. And I think it's starting to be respected a bit more. I think to some extent it's being viewed as a writing exercise. That people say, well, can you do it? But in order to, as a bridge to something else. I think more and more it's starting to emerge as an accepted form within, and hopefully we'll see more collections like this. But Barbara's definitely a very good one to start with.
I don't think I've read very much flash fiction, but that sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're saying, Rónán, that it's an accepted form, because isn't it sad? Because it takes far more skill, to write a short piece, a short story, than it does to write a novel. I am a total believer in that. I think they are actually the masters of the craft.
It's a whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Miniature, condensed. Cauvery, what have you got for us next?
So I'm going to suggest a writer called Claire Boylan. And she was somebody I read nearly 20 years ago. And it was a book called Black Baby. And I really loved that book. It was the first book, and I think for a long time since, probably the only book that dealt with the issues of race, in modern Ireland. She was a short story writer, she was a journalist, and she was really well known in her trade. Unfortunately, she as well died very young. She was only 58. I loved the book because it was actually a treatise on loneliness, because the book is about a spinster. She's in her 60s. And what happens when a woman turns up with a black baby on her doorstep. The book has a good few twists in it. Her loneliness makes her take in this woman and her baby. And, for somebody who all her life had given money into the box, at the church for the black babies, to suddenly find she's a spinster, to suddenly have this family of mother and child arrive in her house. It's a really fantastic book. And she's actually written several other books, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't read. But, with this conversation, Sean, having revisited Black Baby, I am now determined to actually go back and read the rest of her books.
And she didn't die all that long ago, 2006, I see.
Yeah, 2006. That's right. Yeah. She was extremely well respected, and she was a really sort of a master at her craft because she wrote books and short stories and was a journalist as well.
So it was the mother of the child and the baby that arrived, or what?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and a fantastic twist at the end as well. So
next, let's go back to see what Rónán has for us.
Okay, well, I'm still mixing it up, I suppose. So, Mind on Fire by Arnold Thomas Fanning. This is a memoir. It was in about 2 or 3 years ago. Arnold's about my age, his mid-20s or thereabouts. But this is a story, and it's probably one of the most honest books I've ever read. It's about his mental breakdown. He suffered from manic depression, and I remember, when I was in my teens, I'm 45 now. When I was in my teens and 20s and getting into music, there was a lot of discussion about manic depression, and it was almost code for genius. People almost used to say that these people were disturbed, or you had like Brian Wilson who stayed in bed for 3 years. So the discussion around mental health and mental illness was almost sort of folklore. It was almost romanticized, as if it was somehow a sign that when you had a brilliant mind, there was a downside, and that was your mental health. And I think there's been huge strides, I think, in the way it's discussed. Certainly in Ireland, it's discussed more openly now than it ever was. But this book he talks about an incredible honesty about his experience. So this is where he would, on a whim, just get a ferry or fly over to London, end up being homeless on the street, grab a guitar from the arms of a busker, run off wearing no shoes, get angry at people because they didn't think he was a guitar genius, even though he'd never played the guitar before, get arrested, be eating from bins. And like Arnold is from a nice middle class background. This isn't a story of somebody who was on the margins of society. This is somebody who was very much in your sort of your typical sort of stable environment, and whose mental health pushed them to really extremes. And what he does is without really much injected drama, because there's enough drama there, he tells very plainly, this is what happened. And these are extraordinary stories. And when I read this in about 2 days, and I know it's a cliche to say I could not put it down, but I was really, my jaw was open reading this. And he takes you through the journey, and it's beautifully written, and it's actually very, very moving. And again, a very complex thing. I think it's in a story like this, I think that the risk is always that people will say start to feel sympathy for your situation. And there's always the risk that you'll write a bad book about an important subject, and you rely on the important subject to carry you through. But he writes it's an excellent piece of literature, the writing is fantastic. It doesn't try to squeeze anything from the reader. It lays it all in a very plain and very well crafted way. It was an education for me, and also a sense of, there's at times when you read a writer and you're sort of, it sounds corny to say you're grateful, but I don't know if I would ever have understood it any other way than by reading it like this. It's a really important book, and so I wanted to put it on my list.
And fairly recent.
It was 2018, I think. Yeah.
Isn't he a playwright?
Yeah, he started out as a playwright, and he still writes plays, I think. And he talks about that, his experience of falling out of the theatre world, and obviously manic episodes as well, where he's incredibly productive, and in times where he just can't even look at the page. So it's sort of interesting to have that backdrop, I suppose, of how a person's art and creativity is sort of present throughout the book.
It sounds powerful. Cauvery, what have you got next?
Okay, Sean. So my next book is quite an amazing book. It's called Una, and it's by Alice Lyons. It's also her first book. She's an artist and a poet as well, but this is her first book of fiction. And it's such an it's such an unusual book. It's not an easy read. You have to be in the mood for it nearly. There's a lot of introspection, quite a lot of heavy stuff in it. But what's really unusual about this book and what struck me was that in the entire book, she doesn't use the alphabet O. And there's a reason for it. I'm not going to tell you why, because you need to read the book.
Isn't the title Una?
Yes, it's only in the title.
Okay.
It's only in the title. Okay. It's a work of art in that alone that you could write an entire
name
book.
For that kind of a writing thing. Does anybody know what
Yes,
it's
and I had actually written it down somewhere and I can't remember it now. Maybe it'll come to me before I finish telling you about the book. I'm just going to read from the jacket. It's the story of first-generation American immigrants, a child of first-generation American immigrants. They live in a very affluent New Jersey suburb. The child's mother dies. And because there's so much silence about her death, that nobody's allowed to talk about it. So, she grows up with this, literally not having expressed her grief. And then she returns to Ireland, to Leitrim, which is in the northwest of Ireland. And it's how she copes and what happens. But she's also an artist, not just Alice Lyons, but the character in the book is an artist. And just the description of the various colors in the artist's palette, that alone is worth reading the book for, apart from the story. I'm just going to read you a small section. I don't know whether you can see, I have literally, the book is full of dog-eared bits because I just found so many parts of it so fantastic. The prose was just so very beautiful. She's describing where this child lives. They named the place Urban Farms. This is the neighborhood. They named the place Urban Farms. Urban because they were street kids and urban was safe, familiar. Farms were in the undistant past and they had failed. Farms had meant peasants, mud, penury, burdened beasts, sepia grannies and granddads in smudged rags, hunched, battered in huts, famine, disease. Farms were unsuccessful. Farms were unclean. Urban farms was a new, clean thing. Urban farm residents didn't till the land. They plunked residences. They landscaped the landscape. They hired newly arrived Italians and Hispanics as lawn guys. They didn't get their hands in that dirt. They had azaleas in it. They had nice trees. It was a leisure land. Her prose right through, her descriptions of even picking up a brush, an artist's brush and trying to figure out what color she was going to use and, how she layered the colors. Actually, it's quite revealing to see how artists work and how they think. But interestingly enough, this book as well, though it's set in modern times, comes back to that big Irish longing for land, and what it does to communities and what it does to individual farmers. And it's a really fabulous book, but you need to set aside some quiet time. It's not a book that you want to be interrupted when you're reading. It's a hard read, but good read.
So I want to pass it over to Rónán because I know this book, I'm planning to read it because Rónán tweeted about it a few months ago and I ordered it. So I have a copy. I'm going to be reading it in March. Yeah. And I was listening to what you read very carefully and I did not hear any O's. And
they genuinely aren't. I mean, I was looking out for it right through. Now, having said that, there's one small chapter that has O's, but is deliberate. And I can't say anything more. It's just one very small chapter, but the entire rest of the book has no O's. How amazing is that?
I did find the jargony word for constrained writing, lipogram.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So, Rónán, do you have anything to say about this book? Because you put it on my radar.
Yeah, I think Cauvery covers it very well. I read that after I read Jan Foss's Eyes Another. So a very slow book. And it was when I started, influenced by you actually, Sean, I started moving to reading more than one book at a time. I only keep two on the go. So I have a morning book and an evening book. And Una is a very evening book. When your mind is getting into that sort of state, or maybe you're a bit more open to stream of consciousness, you're a bit more more fluid, you're a bit more, you're getting ready for bed. And it's not that it's a passive book at all. It's actually very imaginative. I think the poetry And the painting influence on the book, as Cauvery said, is huge. There are stylistic touches that come from those other forms. And we see that so often in Ireland where people work in more than one form. Sarah Baum, is another artist, Buckle, and a musician. You do get that crossover, and it just gives you nice little textures in the book. And I suppose a very textured book is what I say. They're like very subtle touches. Because I really loved the Jan Fosse, and I was like, how am I going to come down from that? And this was a really good match.
Now, my biggest challenge is, can I wait until March to start reading it? It sounds fabulous. Rónán, what's your next pick?
So the next one I have is called Big Girl, Small Town by Michelle Gallen.
And let me just barge in and say, you put it on my radar and I've got my copy right here.
Oh, great, snap. So I really love this book. The setting here, and just for people who aren't familiar with Ireland, Ireland's been independent for about 100 years, but one of the most divisive things over that period is that the country, which has 32 counties, 6 are in Northern Ireland and remained part of the UK, and the other 26 counties as the Republic of Ireland. And particularly since the 70s up until the mid-90s or so, there was a huge amount of violence, terrorist activity, conflict with police and so on, which is referred to as the Troubles. So you heard that in the title of the book, Cauvery referred to. So that's the backdrop for this book, which is that the Troubles have subsided, but those elements in society are still there. So the setup is that there's one character, a lead character called Magella, she lives with her mother. She's a bit of an outsider, socially awkward. She works in a chip shop, and that provides a window into the whole town and a sort of premise for her interaction. And it really is, it's a 300-page character study of Magella, which I would have thought is technically a very, very difficult thing to pull off, but she does it brilliantly. Magella is a very engaging character. And one of the ways, I think, just from a technical point of view as to why I think that works, is that in order to do that, you have to have a character who's both interesting, but you can't have 300 pages of an interesting character. So she's so interesting, but she's also around other people a bit more passive. So she acts as a sort of an invitation to other people to open up around her and to show their personality, because they don't really take her as seriously. So they're comfortably themselves. And there are a lot of strange people in the town. So I think it gives you a window into a very interesting mind. I think it gives you a window into an interesting setup, which is a border town. So it's kind of neither one thing nor the other. And also the unsteady backdrop you have where, yeah, the Troubles are over, but still everything that went with the Troubles. So for example, organized crime is still very much there. Intimidation is still there. There are still certain people you don't mess with, even though when they come in, you say, "Hiya, Sean, what do you have?" And they'll say, "Asher, give us a cod and chips, batter burger and chips, and a batter sausage." And you act normally, even though you know this person could be quite menacing. But it's quite a funny book in a light way. So it's not trying to deliver big set pieces and laughs. There's just an observation of human nature. So I thought it was a really, and it's a debut as well. It's incredibly accomplished. I don't like I'm a debut author myself. I know Cauvery has 3 novels, but for myself, people say for a debut, you kind of go, "Oh, what is it? Are you not giving me a real score? Is that just because I'm a debut?" But what I mean by that is it demonstrates skills that you think are impossible to learn in your first book. And it was so that really impressed me. So Big Girl, Small Town. It was been nominated for a few awards as well. So it's nice to see it get recognition.
And I didn't realize how much more there was to it than the comedy aspect. So it makes me even more interested to read it. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Great. Cauvery, what have you got?
So I have a book for you called Knocknagow, and it's by a man called Charles Kickham. This book has the amazing record of having been the longest for 50 years. It was a bestseller. Can you imagine? Wow. I mean, it's just amazing. So it was published in 1873. It's about a village called Knocknagow and the life of the rural Irish peasants immediately after the famine. What drew me to the book is that literally the very same people still exist. The nature of Ireland hasn't changed. The nature of rural Ireland hasn't changed. The book deals with issues of tenancy and landlords who were so cruel, even after post-famine as well. They were so mean. It centers around this landowner, Garrett Butler, and his agent, Isaac Pender. And the landowner's nephew comes, he's feeling his way through. He probably is going to inherit. And he comes and takes residence in one of the tenants' homes. And, you have to read the book to see how that happens. The characters are so well drawn. Let me put it this way. It's in Ireland, set out in a Dickensian way. And, if you want to read Irish writers, this is a great place to start, because if you read this book, you know all the issues that people even now are drawing on. So it's a great starting book, I think, if you haven't read many Irish writers. It sets the scene really for what is to follow, even to this day, even, to the book that I referred to earlier on, to Una. A lot of the issues are still alive. And it's amazing that book for 50 years or more remained the single largest selling book in Ireland.
It's the first 19th century Irish novel I've ever heard of, and I had not heard of it before. So thank you. I will be getting to that one for sure.
Apart from Dracula, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Can't forget that.
I thought it was a Hungarian novel, but no.
Irish people are famous for claiming everything, including Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
So the next book I have, and for my last two books, I jokingly said to Sean recently in a message that I was going to start a book club called Not a Sean Book, where we would only read the stuff that Sean doesn't finish and doesn't like, just as a sort of second pair of eyes over this stuff. So the last two, I picked things that I
also known as the Quality Literature Club.
So I picked the last two, which I think I just wanted, like a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of, grain of sand in the underpants for Sean, right? On this. And the reason why, but they're both excellent books. The Firestarters by Jan Garrison. And the reason why I say that is because there is an element of magical realism here, which I know Sean is not always, has not always enjoyed in other writers. So the context for this one, again, it's set in Northern Ireland in East Belfast. And for those people who don't know, on the 12th of July is marching season for the sort of Protestant community. There are historical reasons for that choice, and that's where there will be marches around the city streets, and there will also be massive bonfires. So as it happens, I read this the day after I met Cauvery for the first time, because I read it after coming back from the Bantry, or the West Cork Literature Festival, Bantry, and it was actually the 12th of July. So we can always date our relationship from then. We always know the marches come around in Belfast, that's the anniversary of us meeting Cauvery. So I do like to read books in season, actually. So it was lovely to read it when that was on. And it's a very, very interesting story. It's a story of two fathers, really, both of whom are scared of their children. One is a former paramilitary, so a former terrorist, who suspects that his son there's a sort of one guy starting all the fires in Belfast who's become an anonymous sort of viral sensation on YouTube. And this guy suspects his son is the guy. The other one is a new father who's single parenting, who thinks that his daughter may be a siren, sort of a Greek siren. So in other words, a person who has the ability to draw other people towards malice in their lives. And from there, he's a doctor. And from there, he becomes aware of a range of other similar children. So I think my theme of the day is doing difficult things well. And I think if you were to set me an impossible challenge to write a story about such a big annual event in Belfast as the 12th, to be able to write it in a way that it sits in the right place in terms of the background and the foreground, to introduce those elements of magical realism that didn't just feel like a distraction or didn't feel like it was some sort of, ornamentation rather than something essential to the book. I would think that's a lot to pull off. This book is a book of the highest quality, and it achieves all that brilliantly. Jan is a very, very good storyteller. She's also a huge reader. Like, Jan reads over 300 books a year. She spent last year reading all the Agatha Christie books. She's a huge fan of soap operas. She reads serious literature. She's judging the International Literature Prize in Dublin this year. So she's able to, more than anyone I know, she has that kind of broad range between popular culture right up to serious literary stuff, and is able to draw on that in the writing. So there isn't a comparable book. I can't say if you liked this, you like Firestarters, but I think that in itself is enough to commend it.
I will consider it. Sounds really interesting. What have you got next, Cauvery?
Okay, so I have a kind of a really well-known Irish writer. Her name is Kate O'Brien. She wrote books that are set in the late 1800s. And the book that I absolutely love, the very first book I read about 20 years ago, and unfortunately didn't have the time to reread it before talking to you this time, Sean. It's called The Anteroom. It's set in a very middle-class, well-to-do Catholic family, and the mother is dying. This young woman, Agnes Mulqueen, is waiting. She's sort of reflecting and thinking about, her life, and she's waiting for her sister and brother-in-law to come back to Ireland to be there before the mother dies. And she's actually secretly in love with the brother-in-law. She also has a syphilitic brother who's absolutely a useless chap. The father's alive. He's sort of, just kind of in the background. And it's looking back on all the things that, she could have had and should have had. And really, it's one of the early, I don't know whether Rónán would agree, but, one of the early feminist texts. So it's a lovely book. And it's a great introduction to the rest of Kate O'Brien's books.
I don't think I knew about her before, but I looked her up. This was maybe her debut or maybe second novel, 1934.
I think it was a second. Yeah, I think it was a second. I think the first one might have been Mary Lavelle, I think, or maybe not. Don't quote me on that now.
Mary Lavelle is her most famous, according to Wikipedia. Yeah. That's all I know. And she was a lesbian.
Was she?
According to Wikipedia. So that's what I just.
Oh.
One of her lovers was the novelist E.M. Delafield.
Oh.
Author of, what is it called? I think I have it on my shelf and I haven't read it yet. Diary of a Provincial Lady is her most famous.
Oh, yes, I know of the book. Yeah.
And my period of British literature and Irish literature seems to be the 1930s. So I will be getting to this one very soon.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful book. It must have spoken to so many women of that time.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you. I think I know. Is it now time for Rónán's last pick?
It is my last one. Thanks, Sean.
So we're going to end on a queer note, I believe.
We are indeed. So this is Call Him Mine by Tim Mcgowan. Again, this is something that it wouldn't typically, I don't think, be a Sean pick because it's more in a sort of genre fiction, which I know you tend not to enjoy as much. So this is a story. It's set in Mexico. Tim himself lives in Mexico, and it's about two gay men. They're partners. One is a journalist, the other is a photographer, and they're doing sort of investigative work around the narcotics and the narco sort of crime scene in Mexico. They find a dead body that they're not supposed to find, and this is an environment where the police are no protection against the gangs. The gangs are much more powerful than the police. What happens? I don't think I'm giving too much away because I think this is more or less on the back cover. Is that the main character Andrew, his boyfriend Carlos gets killed because they witnessed that. The rest of the book is really a mix of the main characters coping with the grief of that, kind of being just about functioning, while also being into a situation where he can't walk away from this, not because he's determined to see it through, but just he's too incriminated by having witnessed what he's witnessed. And really that brings you into, so I think you can read the book through a few different lenses. You can enjoy the writing, which is very good, very lively, and there's lots of real personality. I think one thing about genre fiction, I don't read a huge amount of it, and one of the reasons is when I was growing up, my mother watched police dramas all the time. Basically from about 1983 to about 1995, I watched police dramas, whether I liked it or not. And I've seen them all. I think I need another 50 years of a break before I can go back to it. I think what's interesting about it is that you can enjoy just the story, the color of the setting. If you're interested in genre fiction, it pushes those buttons too. But I just thought the main character, that was an unusual take. And for somebody who doesn't read a lot of genre fiction, from time to time, I sort of feel, should I dip into it? Will I read a bit more of it? And this was a hit for me in that sense, in that I was going in because I sort of just felt attracted to it. And I really enjoyed it. I felt it very vivid. And I felt it a very refreshing reading experience as someone who doesn't read a lot from that genre. And I think as well, if you're thinking about Irish literature, it wouldn't be an obvious choice to pick a Mexican crime novel.
I will definitely consider it, Rónán, especially if you send me your copy and you use maybe pink Post-it notes to mark all the gay parts and maybe black Post-it notes to mark all the violent parts, and I will pick and choose accordingly. But no, that sounds very interesting, definitely. So he lives in, the author lives in Mexico permanently, like full time.
Yeah, he is. I think he's a journalist himself. He's actually really worth following on Twitter. Very funny guy. He spent, I think in November, he spent a month posting in Dutch. Not real Dutch, but just English pretending to be Dutch. So he just has a good personality, and I think that comes across in his writing. And if people enjoy that, there's a follow-up to it just that recently.
I will put his Twitter handle in the show notes as well.
Can I just read you one very, very short thing from Black Baby? And I came across this quote from the book itself, which literally describes all the books that both Rónán and myself have spoken about. Really, it's the basis for all Irish stories. And this is it. The main character says, "I have a theory. The people of this country are full of kindness, but always to strangers. When a relationship is required, whether landlady, mother, husband, wife, complications and hostilities arise, they do not have the facility for intimacy." And I think so many Irish books are based on this premise. And I was really kind of quite struck by that.
Interesting way to round out our discussion. And even though we have gone way over time, which is like the happiest problem, my eye keeps going to the bottom book on the pile of books behind you, Cauvery. Does that say Naked Irish?
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, Sean. It's by Claire O'D. I'm glad you spotted it, because I'm actually using it as my literally my reference, my go-to book for the next book I'm writing. It's such a great, insightful book into different aspects of Ireland and of modern Ireland.
So it's nonfiction.
It's nonfiction. It says a portrait of a nation beyond the cliches.
So it's not a book about Irish nudism. It's
no, I'm sort of dipping into it as I'm writing my next book.
If you're interested, Sean, I know the Irish Fire Service does an annual calendar of Irish firemen. If that's of any interest, it's not. I wouldn't say I'd say it's a Sean book, but not quite literary. So anyway, if I see one of those, I'll pick one up for you.
I would like to expand the definition of literary and put that on the list. And lucky for me, you have my address. That is awesome. All right, people, this was just a fascinating discussion, and I am anticipating that the TBRs of the people that are participating in the Irish Readathon have been swollen delightfully accordingly. So thank you so much for all the recommendations, and I would love to have you come back and do this again sometime.
Well, thanks very much for having us, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.